They were the workhorses doing the dirty work, the steady producers, the players whose impact on the diamond wasn't necessarily showcased in highlight reels or individual accolades, and yet they were instrumental in their team's success. Some of these players were underrated their whole careers, while others were legitimate superstars but are now almost forgotten. Here are the most underrated players in MLB history. Let's start with the first great MLB pitcher, whose legacy rarely gets appreciated anymore. No, we're not talking about Cy Young or Walter Johnson, but the guy who preceded the modern era of baseball dominance. Of course, we're talking about Christy Mathewson, the first true superstar pitcher in baseball history, and arguably the most impactful player of the dead ball era. Today, MLB is one of the most famous sports leagues in the world, and many people give credit to guys like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig for pushing baseball forward. After them, Jackie Robinson gets credit for breaking the color barrier, and Mickey Mantle for making baseball America's pastime. But maybe none of that would have been possible without Mathewson. In the early 1900s and 1910s, the 6'1" right-hander was by far the best and most popular baseball player in the world. MLB used to send him to different cities days before games to promote the sport. Because of Mathewson's dominance, MLB implemented several rule changes, including the modern pitching distance and mound regulations. Before these rules, games were often dominated by pitching duels that resulted in 1-0 finishes. Mathewson won 373 games in his career, leading the league in wins 4 times. Every pitcher that ever came through MLB has practiced the Mathewson delivery at some point. That smooth, overhand motion with perfect control. Because of his dominance, impact on the rules, and the popularity he brought to baseball, he is one of the most important players of all time, but rarely gets the recognition for it. Unfortunately for Phil, when you look back at those championship runs, he doesn't have the signature moments. DiMaggio was glorified and admired by the entire nation, and rightfully so because he really was elite and was the best player of his era. But as many baseball historians have documented, Joe often got too much credit at the expense of Rizzuto and the rest of the Yankees. DiMaggio won MVP awards, but Rizzuto was a better all-around player than most people realize. It was Phil, not Joe, who was usually making the clutch defensive plays up the middle. And Rizzuto's presence allowed DiMaggio to focus purely on hitting. In 1950, when DiMaggio was struggling with injuries, Rizzuto led the Yankees to a World Series championship and won the MVP award himself, hitting .324 with incredible defense at shortstop. The rest of the Yankees from the 40s and 50s were also quite underrated. While the world was infatuated with DiMaggio and later Mickey Mantle, from the first Dynasty era, a guy that never gets mentioned is Tommy Henrich. One of the most clutch hitters of all time, known as Old Reliable for his ability to come through in big moments. From the second Dynasty, there's Gil McDougald, one of the best utility infielders ever who could play any infield position at an all-star level, but still accepted his role as a versatile player. Luke Appling will rarely get mentioned when there's a discussion about the best shortstops ever, and yet he made more all-star teams than Ernie Banks and had a higher career batting average than Derek Jeter. Averaging .310 for his career with incredible plate discipline, Appling leads the White Sox in many statistical categories. With his 16-year career, only a handful of shortstops in MLB history rank above this underrated Chicago legend. Similar to Appling, this next all-time great is one of the best players ever at his position, but almost never gets mentioned in debates for the best first baseman of all time. Orlando Cepeda was a powerful first baseman at 6'2", and he led the National League in home runs and RBIs multiple times, ranking among the top sluggers in baseball history. Cepeda won the MVP award in 1967, and if we count his offensive production throughout his career, the Baby Bull racked up nearly 400 home runs and over 1,300 RBIs. However, Cepeda isn't the most underrated power hitter from this era. There's one player that most casual fans probably haven't even heard of, despite him hitting over 500 home runs, which ranks in the top 20 all time. And that guy is Harmon Killebrew. An 11-time All-Star and American League MVP, Killebrew was one of the premier power hitters of the 1960s with the Minnesota Twins. Other than Babe Ruth, Killebrew was one of the few players who led the American League in home runs 6 times, averaging 32 home runs per season over his 22-year career. Apart from being one of the top sluggers of all time, Killebrew was also one of the most feared hitters ever, with over 1,580 RBIs, which ranks in the top 15 on the all-time list. If MLB had tracked advanced metrics in his era, Killebrew would rank in the top 10 in slugging percentage too. Speaking of home run champions, let's talk about the player who won this prestigious title in 1982, a guy they called the Straw Man long before anyone else. Darryl Strawberry is one of only 30 players with over 300 home runs in MLB, and he's almost never mentioned in the same breath as other sluggers like Mark McGwire or Frank Thomas, even though Strawberry was more consistent than both of them and did it while dealing with personal struggles. There's another power-hitting legend from that era that might be even better than Darryl Strawberry, another guy that nobody mentions anymore. Dale Murphy is a two-time MVP who averaged 32 home runs and 95 RBIs during his career, and did so with incredible consistency. Murphy hit over 30 home runs 6 times during his 15 years in the league, which is impressive for any era. He also won 5 Gold Gloves and was one of the fastest players on the base paths. This next player was a 12-time All-Star and a Hall of Famer, and yet he was always in the shadow of his much more popular teammates. Gary Carter had all the skills in the world. He could hit for power, he had one of the strongest arms behind the plate, and he was durable too. When he was the primary catcher in Montreal, the kid averaged 24 home runs and 85 RBIs between 1977 and 1979-1984, establishing himself as the premier catcher when it was one of the most competitive positions in baseball. Then Carter became part of the New York Mets and helped lead them to the 1986 World Series championship. His role in that championship was undeniable. Carter was the emotional leader and the clutch performer when it mattered most. After his playing career, many people forget that Carter finished with over 300 home runs and 1,200 RBIs, joining some of the most elite company in baseball history among catchers. But Gary Carter isn't the only underrated catcher in recent memory. This next player would be much more appreciated if he played in today's analytics-driven game, where his patience and on-base skills would be properly valued. Tim McCarver was more than just a catcher. He was a strategic mind who could handle pitchers and work counts like few others could. McCarver established himself as one of the smartest players in baseball during his 2 decades in the majors, averaging a .271 batting average with excellent plate discipline. Tim was a key part of multiple Cardinals championship teams and later became one of the most respected broadcasters in the game, showing his deep understanding of baseball strategy. Speaking of great catchers, before the days of modern catching metrics and advanced defensive statistics, one backstop was making all-star teams and handling some of the best pitching staffs in baseball. However, Thurman Munson doesn't get the recognition for being one of the greatest Yankees catchers in team history, partly because his career was tragically cut short, and he played during an era when catchers weren't valued as highly. The captain of those late 70s Yankees teams, Munson was the emotional leader and clutch performer. From 1975 to 1978, he averaged 300 with 15 home runs and 95 RBIs, establishing himself as both an offensive and defensive force. Munson was the 1970 Rookie of the Year and the 1976 AL MVP, becoming the first catcher to win the award since Yogi Berra. But today's MLB is a much different league than it was 30 or 40 years ago, and is mostly dominated by power hitters and advanced analytics. In the 2024 season, there were 15 players who hit over 40 home runs, while in 1988 there were only 3. Before the steroid era, players rarely hit for both power and average consistently, and their role was to contribute in specific ways within their team system. For that reason, there weren't many versatile players from the 80s and 90s who were underrated, even though they were exceptional. Tony Phillips was nicknamed the Utility Man because he was taking teams to school on a nightly basis with his fundamentally sound approach and deep skill set. Phillips led the American League in walks multiple times, and between 1989 and 1996, he averaged 12 home runs, 75 RBIs, and 15 stolen bases per season, which doesn't sound like much today, but if you watched Phillips play, you could always count on productive at-bats and solid defense at multiple positions. A player of similar versatility was Craig Biggio, who averaged 15 home runs and 20 stolen bases per season, between 1991 and 2004. Biggio ran the Astros offense like a Swiss Army knife, and his leadership was instrumental on multiple playoff teams. Tim Raines also deserves to be mentioned. Even though he averaged fewer than 15 home runs per season in his career, he's one of only a few people with over 800 stolen bases in MLB history. Another player who's still occasionally mentioned is also not known for his power, and he's a poster boy for a really good all-around player that's likely not going to end up in the Hall of Fame. Kenny Lofton is a six-time All-Star who played in multiple World Series, but when there's a discussion about the best center fielders of the 1990s, his name rarely gets mentioned. Lofton's reputation was built on his speed and defense, with over 600 stolen bases and Gold Glove caliber play in center field. Overall, in his career, Kenny was an extremely consistent player, especially during the Indians' playoff runs in the mid-90s. Other than Rickey Henderson, Lofton is probably the best leadoff hitter under 6 feet, always ready to work a count and create scoring opportunities that don't show up in traditional stats. Another borderline Hall of Famer has a career very similar to Lofton, with multiple All-Star appearances and several Gold Gloves. His nickname was The Hawk, and Andre Dawson was one of the first 5-tool players in modern MLB history. During his 11-year tenure with the Cubs and Expos, Dawson averaged 25 home runs, 90 RBIs, 15 stolen bases, with Gold Glove defense in right field, routinely making spectacular catches and throwing out base runners. And do you know how many players have accumulated over 400 home runs in their career, but are still not properly recognized among the all-time greats? There are several. Fred McGriff, Gary Sheffield, Larry Walker, and Jim Edmonds. McGriff was a consistent power hitter who made 5 All-Star teams, but he played during the steroid era and his clean numbers were overshadowed. Sheffield was one of the most feared hitters of his generation with over 500 home runs, but his outspoken personality sometimes overshadowed his incredible talent. A similar story is with Larry Walker, who put up incredible numbers but played half his games in Colorado, leading people to diminish his accomplishments even though he was dominant both at home and on the road. Walker is one of the best all-around players of all time, with a .313 career average, 383 home runs, and exceptional defense. But in the end, being underrated is subjective, and for some people, certain players will feel more underrated than others. So we've got to give a mention to a couple of legends in specific roles like Lee Smith and Bruce Sutter as closers. Defensive specialists from the 80s like Ozzie Smith and Alan Trammell, contact hitters such as Tony Gwynn, Wade Boggs, and Rod Carew, and complete players like Bobby Grich, Dwight Evans, and Darryl Evans. Baseball history is filled with incredible stories, but some of the most compelling tales belong to players whose names don't roll off the tongue as easily as Ruth, DiMaggio, or Mantle. These underrated legends remind us that greatness isn't always measured in highlight reels or media coverage. From Christy Mathewson literally shaping the modern game, to Phil Rizzuto anchoring championship dynasties in DiMaggio's shadow, to power hitters like Harmon Killebrew quietly launching over 500 home runs into history. These players were the backbone of baseball's greatest moments. What makes a player truly underrated? Sometimes it's playing in the wrong era, like Dale Murphy in Atlanta's down years. Sometimes it's playing the right way without controversy, like Tim McCarver's cerebral approach. And sometimes it's simply the cruel reality that not everyone can be in the spotlight, even when they deserve it. These players didn't need the recognition to be great. They were great because of what they brought to the game every single day. They were the steady producers, the clutch performers, the guys who made everyone around them better. So the next time you're watching baseball or debating the all-time greats, remember these names. Because baseball isn't just about the superstars everyone remembers. It's about the workhorses who built the foundation that made those superstars possible. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments which underrated player you think deserves more recognition. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into baseball history.